Spring, 1943. The war in the air belongs to Germany. From the Bay of Biscay to the gates of Berlin, the Luftwaffe rules the sky with the confidence of veterans who have forgotten what it means to be challenged. The contrails above Europe are German, the smoke that falls from them, American. Every morning, formations of B-17s and B-24s rise from the airfields of England, vast, shining fleets of aluminum, carrying the promise of daylight victory. And every afternoon, they return in fragments. Bombers stagger across the channel, engines burning, wings shredded, crews missing. Over the radio, German fighter aces joke between engagements. The Americans send babies in flying coffins. To them, it is not cruelty. It is routine. At that moment, the balance of the air war feels eternal. The Luftwaffe's Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs tear through the bomber streams at will. The Americans respond with escorts, the burly P-47 Thunderbolt and the twin-engined P-38 Lightning, both powerful, both courageous, but both bound by distance. Their fuel tanks run dry long before the bombers reach Germany. Beyond the Rhine, the sky belongs to the enemy. Then, somewhere in the quiet corners of a testing field, a new silhouette appears. It is smaller, sleeker, an unfamiliar shape glinting in the English sunlight. Its lines are clean, its nose long and narrow, its engine not American at all but British. A Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same heart that beats within the Spitfire. Engineers call it the North American P-51. To the seasoned eyes of German pilots, it looks like an ornament, not a weapon. Too elegant to be dangerous, too new to matter. Photographs circulate among Luftwaffe squadrons, prompting laughter in the ready rooms. Another American experiment. Let them try. But beneath its polished surface, the Mustang hides something neither side yet understands. Speed without exhaustion, range without compromise, grace with purpose. It is not yet feared, not yet proven. It waits, like an answer still forming, in the hangars of a restless air force. High above the continent, the German pilots still laugh. Their laughter drifts across the radio waves, confident and unbroken. But what they don't know is that the machine they mock will soon erase their advantage entirely. In 1940, the world was on fire. Europe burned beneath the Blitz, and Britain stood alone, bloodied but unbroken. Every dawn brought the same plea from London to Washington. Fighters, we need fighters. America's factories were not yet the arsenal of democracy, and its air arm was still learning what modern war required. Yet one company, young and ambitious, decided to answer the call. North American Aviation, led by James Dutch Kindleberger, offered something reckless, not to build Britain's outdated P-40 under license, but to design an entirely new fighter from scratch. In just 120 days. It was a gamble so audacious that even the British hesitated. But desperation is the mother of invention, and the deal was signed. In a hangar in Inglewood, California, engineers began sketching through the night. They built what no one had asked for, a fighter defined not by power, but by efficiency. The result was unlike anything else in the sky. Sleek laminar flow wings that cut drag in half. A fuselage so aerodynamic that it seemed to glide even while standing still. The prototype rolled out in September 1940, ahead of schedule, below budget, and far beyond expectation. When it first took flight, test pilots reported something strange. It climbed easily, turned smoothly, and burned less fuel than anything of its kind. Yet the U.S. Army remained unimpressed. America already had the P-40. Rugged, proven, familiar. The generals saw no need for another single-seat fighter. The Mustang, as it would soon be called, was a machine without a home, admired but unwanted. But across the Atlantic, British engineers saw what the Americans had missed. Beneath its unassuming frame lay potential waiting to be unleashed. The Allison engine it carried was dependable but limited, too weak at altitude, too slow above 15,000 feet. The British had something better, the Rolls-Royce Merlin. It was the heart of the Spitfire, a symphony of pistons that sang at the edge of the stratosphere. When the Merlin met the Mustang, the result was alchemy. Speed leapt past 430 miles per hour, range stretched beyond 1,000 miles, and the aircraft's ceiling soared to 40,000 feet. For the first time, the Allies possessed a fighter that could outclimb, outdive, and outlast anything the Luftwaffe could send against it. The perfect union. American design, British engine, shared necessity. Yet few believed it mattered. The air war over Europe was already a graveyard of experiments. New aircraft appeared every season, promising revolutions that never came. The Mustang's promise was whispered about in hangars, noted in reports, but ignored in strategy. It was another prototype among many, untested, untrusted, unseen. But the facts were already changing. The Mustang could travel farther, fight longer, and fly higher than any Escort before it. It was a machine designed for the next phase of war, a war not yet imagined by those still counting losses in the present. In the cold calculus of innovation, it was a contradiction, a fighter born from a request that no one made, perfected by an enemy's engine, and destined to define the skies it was never built for. On paper, it was an experiment. In practice, it was evolution. And while generals dismissed it, the storm over Europe was building, one that would soon demand exactly what this forgotten fighter could do. In the hangars of England, the future sat waiting, wings folded, engine silent, until history caught up. By 1943, America had chosen its faith, daylight bombing. While Britain struck at night, cloaked in darkness and flame, the United States would fight under the sun, believing that precision and courage could destroy the German war machine from above. It was a doctrine born from optimism and paid for in blood. Every morning, the skies over England filled with silver wings, formations of B-17s and B-24s stretching for miles, engines droning in endless harmony. They called them flying fortresses, great armored leviathans that carried the weight of strategy and sacrifice. Inside, 10 men sat in steel cages, trusting their guns and each other. They believed that if enough bombers flew together, they could defend themselves. It was a belief the Luftwaffe was eager to test, over France, over the Low Countries, and deep into Germany. The formations met squadrons of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs diving through the sunlight. German aces like Adolf Galland, Günther Rall, and Walter Ursau tore into the bomber streams with surgical precision. They attacked in coordinated waves, head-on or from below, where the fortresses were blind. The sky became a crucible of aluminum and fire. The Americans fought back with discipline, but not reach. Their escort fighters, the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning, were powerful but thirsty. They could protect the bombers only as far as the Rhine. Beyond that line, the formations flew alone, slow and exposed, across 400 miles of hostile airspace. The Germans waited there, patient as hunters. The results were catastrophic. In August and October, the 8th Air Force sent waves of bombers toward the ball-bearing plants of Schweinfurt and Regensburg, targets meant to cripple the German war industry. Of the 376 aircraft that left England on the first raid, 60 never returned. On the second, 77 vanished into smoke. Thousands of men were lost in missions that achieved little but proof of failure. The phrase "flying fortress" began to sound hollow. Crews returned with half their formation missing. wings torn by cannon shells, fuselages painted in the black streaks of burning oil. Some landed on one engine, some not at all, and still the bombers kept flying, because doctrine demanded it, and because there was no other choice. Commanders at High Wycombe and Washington pleaded for a miracle, an escort fighter that could stay with the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Engineers calculated, logisticians argued, and pilots waited. No aircraft had the range, not yet. Meanwhile, in the English countryside, at airfields like Bottisham and Duxford, a new aircraft stood quietly on the tarmac, sleek, unfamiliar, and largely ignored. Its wings glimmered with a promise no one had yet recognized. It was fast, efficient, and untested in combat. Its name, for now, was little more than a curiosity on a maintenance roster, the P-51 Mustang. The stalemate in the skies had reached its breaking point. Every bomber lost proved the limits of bravery. Every raid made it clear that courage alone could not cross a continent. Somewhere in that equation, between endurance and invention, the answer already waited. A new fighter, overlooked and underestimated, was about to change everything. It began, as revolutions often do, in a hangar filled with doubt. The P-51 was a fine aircraft, but not yet a great one. A design admired for its promise, dismissed for its limitations. The Allison engine that powered its early versions was reliable, but shallow-breathing, gasping for air above 15,000 feet. In an age when battles were fought at 30,000, that flaw was fatal. Then, across the Atlantic, came an idea that would change everything. British engineers from Rolls-Royce looked at the Mustang's airframe and saw potential. An American body waiting for a British heart. They fitted the new version with the Merlin 61, the same supercharged engine that roared in the Spitfire. It was an unlikely marriage, American design and British precision, born not of strategy, but of necessity. When the new prototype took to the sky in 1943, even the test pilots were unprepared. The numbers told the story before the headlines did. 437 miles per hour at 30,000 feet, a service ceiling of 40,000, a range of more than 1,000 miles with drop tanks. It climbed like a rocket and cruised like a whisper. A pilot at the controls described it simply as a machine that breathes. Suddenly, the problem of distance, the invisible wall that had crippled the bomber offensive, was no longer a problem at all. The P-51B Mustang could cross the channel, escort the bombers to Berlin, and bring its pilot home for dinner. The impossible had been reduced to arithmetic. The news spread quietly through the bases of the 8th Air Force. At Bottisham, Debden, and Leiston, crews trained through the autumn rains, memorizing new checklists, new tactics, new confidence. Mechanics learned the quirks of the Merlin's cooling system. Pilots learned to trust the machine's balance, light on the controls, stable at high speed, forgiving in a dive. The P-51 demanded finesse, not force. It was not a brute like the P-47, nor a twin-engine giant like the P-38. It was poetry in aluminum, a fighter that invited rather than endured its pilot. Still, its debut came not with fanfare, but with silence. The war had no patience for celebration. Production lines at Inglewood and Dallas worked without pause, churning out hundreds of Mustangs each month. They were crated, shipped, assembled, and sent into the grey English winter, their silver skins unmarked by history, for now. On the other side of the channel, the Luftwaffe watched uneasily. Reconnaissance reports mentioned a new type flying escort at high altitude, a long-nosed aircraft faster than expected, climbing higher than any Thunderbolt. At first, the intelligence was dismissed. Another American experiment, they said. Another rumor. But the rumors grew. By December 1943, the first squadrons of P-51Bs crossed into enemy airspace alongside the bomber streams. They did not yet announce themselves with triumph. They merely flew, steady, high, and impossibly far. For the first time, German interceptors found themselves engaged not at the bombers, but before them. The Luftwaffe pilots, who once hunted unopposed beyond the Rhine, now glimpsed sleek, unfamiliar shapes turning against them. Faster, sharper, relentless. The hunters were beginning to feel the weight of pursuit. No one declared the change official. There was no single mission, no single victory to mark it. But in the thin air above occupied Europe, something irreversible had begun. The Mustang was not just a new aircraft, it was a new equation, a balance between reach and endurance, speed and subtlety. A weapon engineered not for spectacle, but for survival. The long-range Escort had arrived quietly, as if history itself were taking a breath before it roared, and soon that roar would echo all the way to Berlin. By the winter of 1943, the sky above Europe had become a graveyard of ambition. The great daylight offensives of the 8th Air Force still rose each morning from England's frozen airfields, but few returned intact. The air war was a contest of endurance, fought at 25,000 feet, where frost, fatigue, and fear weighed as heavily as gravity itself. Now, into this frozen theater, a new shape joined the bomber streams, slender, silver, and unfamiliar. The P-51 Mustang squadrons had arrived. They flew in formation beside the lumbering B-17s and B-24s as the columns of contrails stretched toward Bremen, Kiel, and Hanover. To the bomber crews peering through frost-rimmed glass, the Mustangs looked almost fragile, their long noses gleaming like spears in the sunlight. They were elegant where the thunderbolt was brute, silent where the lightning was twin-voiced thunder. Across the Channel, the Luftwaffe still dismissed them. German pilots, hardened by years of dominance, watched the new American fighters from their airfields and scoffed. Too light, they said, too elegant. To them, these newcomers were art without menace, beauty without bite. But altitude has a way of stripping away illusion. The first encounters began over the North Sea. Messerschmitts climbed to meet the bomber streams, expecting the usual dance of chaos, a few minutes of escort resistance before the Americans turned for home. Yet this time, something different happened. The new fighters did not fall away. They climbed higher. They dove faster. They turned inside the Bf-109s with ease. In seconds, laughter turned to static. The Luftwaffe's radio channels filled with the sound of disbelief. Pilots shouted warnings, misidentifying the aircraft. A new type, high speed, impossible range. One by one, the familiar patterns of attack disintegrated. The Mustangs weren't chasing them. They were waiting for them. From the cockpits of the bombers below, crews could hear the difference too. The chatter on the intercom shifted from resignation to awe. The little friends, they called them, those silver guardians weaving in and out of formation, darting through contrails like arrows through cloud. At altitude, the war's geometry began to change. The Luftwaffe, once the hunter, now found itself being hunted. The P-51's Merlin engine, breathing thin air with British precision and American fury, allowed it to fight where few others could. German pilots who tried to climb above the formation found the Mustangs already there, descending from the sun. Those who dove away found them still behind, patient and tireless. The difference was not only speed, it was endurance. The P-51s did not break off after a few minutes. They stayed. They escorted the bombers all the way to the target and back, flying hours beyond what the Luftwaffe believed possible. Each mission redrew the mental map of the air war. By early 1944, German morale was beginning to crack. Squadrons scrambled in smaller numbers, their fuel reserves thinning, their aces dwindling. Those who survived the first Mustang encounters returned shaken. Reports described a new menace, faster, higher, relentless. They could not understand how an enemy fighter had reached the skies over northern Germany. The belief that the Reich's heartland was safe from daylight attack was evaporating. On the ground, Luftwaffe controllers heard the change in their pilots' voices, the fear beneath the oxygen masks, the disbelief in every transmission. Above them, the contrails crossed, diverged, and disappeared into the grey horizon. For the bomber crews, the change was something quieter. It was the sound of hope. From that winter onward, every mission into the heart of Germany carried a new rhythm. The deep drone of bombers, the rising hum of Merlins, and the faint, distant echo of panic from an enemy who had forgotten what it felt like to be afraid. The tide of the air war was beginning to turn, and on the frozen runways of England, commanders prepared to send the Mustangs even farther, toward the one city no escort had ever reached. By early 1944, the air war over Europe had reached its breaking point. The Mustangs had proven they could fight, but now they needed to prove they could win. The bombers still bled across the sky, their silver bodies limping home in smoke. Courage was no longer enough. The Allies needed a new way to think, not just a new machine to fly. That task fell to men who understood the logic of the sky. Colonel Hubert Zemke and General James Doolittle. Both were tacticians born from chaos, pilots who had lived long enough to distrust old doctrine. The traditional escort formations, tight and defensive, kept fighters tethered to the bombers like guardians on a leash. It protected the bombers, but at a terrible cost. It surrendered initiative. The Luftwaffe dictated the terms of every battle. Zemke and Doolittle decided to end that. The new order was simple and revolutionary. The Mustangs would no longer follow. They would hunt. Instead of clinging to the bomber streams, the P-51s would surge ahead, sweeping the skies clean before the enemy could form. Free-ranging flights, independent of the bomber columns, would stalk German interceptors over their own airfields, attacking as they climbed, scattering formations before they ever reached altitude. It was a shift from defense to offense, from reaction to control. At first, the change unsettled commanders. To release the escorts was to trust the unseen, to let the bombers fly without visible protection. But Doolittle's logic was merciless. Protection meant destruction. Only by breaking the pattern could the Allies break the Luftwaffe. The results came swiftly. In February 1944, during the campaign later known as Big Week, the 8th Air Force struck the German aircraft industry in a series of relentless raids. The Mustangs roamed freely ahead of the bomber streams, their long-range tanks carrying them deep into Germany. At 25,000 feet, the sky was no longer divided into safe zones and kill zones. It was open terrain. Luftwaffe squadrons scrambled from airfields near Brunswick and Leipzig, only to find themselves ambushed before they could form. German radio traffic filled with confusion, reports of attacks from every direction, of enemy fighters appearing where none should be. The once disciplined defensive network disintegrated. Wing leaders shouted into static as their formations broke apart, hunted before they had even begun to hunt. For the bomber crews flying above the clouds, the change was invisible but unmistakable. They reached their targets in formation. The flak still came, the losses still hurt, but now the skies were strangely emptier. The wall of German fighters that had once descended upon them like a storm was gone. The Mustangs had taken the storm apart, piece by piece. What had been a desperate hope, the dream of flying to Berlin and back, was now operational reality. The P-51's range, amplified by its drop tanks, extended from the white cliffs of Dover to the factories of central Germany, and still left enough fuel for combat and return. The Luftwaffe, for the first time since 1939, had lost control of its own airspace. The psychological effect was as devastating as the physical. German pilots, once predators of the sky, now flew with glances over their shoulders. Every climb carried the dread of silver wings above them, every descent the fear of tracers behind. The hunter had become the hunted. From his command post, General Galland could only watch the pattern collapse. He had built his career on the principle that the bomber would always arrive unguarded. That range was the Luftwaffe's shield. Now that shield was gone. Germany's heart, its refineries, its railways, its factories, lay exposed under the sunlight of Allied air power. For the men of the 8th Air Force, the transformation was quiet but profound. They no longer flew toward certain loss. They flew toward purpose. Behind them, the contrails of the P-51s stretched endlessly eastward, vanishing into the distance where Berlin waited. The doctrine of range had rewritten the war, and soon the city that once seemed unreachable would hear the engines of the Mustangs overhead. For years, Berlin had lived beneath an illusion, the belief that distance was defense. The capital of the Reich, nerve center of its industry and ideology, stood hundreds of miles from the nearest Allied base. Even as cities like Hamburg and Cologne burned under night raids, Berlin watched from afar, shrouded in confidence. The Americans could bomb the edges of the empire. Yes, but not its heart. March 4th, 1944, shattered that illusion. Before dawn, the airfields of eastern England roared to life. Across 100 miles of wet countryside, thousands of airmen climbed into their aircraft, bomber crews into their fortresses and liberators, fighter pilots into the narrow cockpits of their Mustangs. The mission was simple and unthinkable: Berlin. The objective that had once been impossible was now plotted calmly on briefing boards. Range tables had changed. The map of Europe was shrinking. As the formation rose through cloud and sunlight, the radios crackled with code names and call signs. The bombers stretched in endless lines toward the horizon, flanked by the new escorts, silver slivers of confidence that gleamed like blades. For the first time, they would not turn back at the Rhine. For the first time, they could go all the way. Over Germany, the Luftwaffe control rooms came alive in confusion. Radar screens lit up with formations so vast they seemed unreal. Commanders shouted into headsets, voices tight with disbelief. Reports flooded in from the west. Massive force inbound, altitude 24,000, heading east. Then another voice shaken. They're escorted all the way. At 11:20 a.m., the first bombs fell on Berlin. Sirens wailed across the city that had once felt untouchable. Workers in the factories, civilians in the streets, officers in the chancellery, all looked upward, expecting the same lumbering formations that had always been intercepted in time. Instead, they saw something new: silver Mustangs diving through flat clouds, their wings flashing in the winter light, dueling Messerschmitts above the heart of the Reich. Dogfights spiraled across the capital, leaving white scars across the grey sky. The Luftwaffe scrambled from airfields at Vernuschen and Rechlin, but the Mustangs met them before they could climb to altitude. For every German fighter that rose, another fell in flame. In the command center, radio discipline broke down. "They're over the city!" one controller cried. "Over Berlin!" The sound of battle was no longer distant thunder. It was above their homes. Below, Berliners watched trails of fire and smoke drift over their rooftops, the site once reserved for occupied France or the English coast. They had believed the capital inviolate, protected by geography and pride. But geography had failed, and pride was burning with it. When the formation turned for home, the sky above Berlin hung silent except for the echo of engines that now carried the war's future. The bombers had reached their target intact. The escorts had done what no aircraft in history had done before: crossed Europe's heart, fought its defenders, and returned unbroken. In his memoirs, Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's most respected tactician, wrote with rare candor, "When we saw Mustangs over Berlin, we knew then that we had lost the air war. It was not defeat by numbers, but by inevitability. The Reich's last shield, the sanctity of distance, had vanished. From that day onward, Berlin was no longer the unreachable city. The air itself had changed hands. For the men who flew that mission, the meaning was clear. The Mustang was not just an escort, it was a declaration that no fortress, no ideology, no empire could hide behind geography any longer. And for the Germans watching from the ground, one truth lingered in the drifting contrails above. The war had finally come home. The bombers turned westward, the Mustangs circling above them like silver phantoms, guiding them back through the clouds. Behind them, Berlin smoldered, its myth broken, its skyline marked by the future. The city had been reached, and soon the air war itself would be decided. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe's skies, was bleeding to death. The empire that had risen on wings of precision and pride was collapsing under the quiet inevitability of exhaustion. What had begun as mastery had become survival, and even that was slipping away. The Mustangs now flew where they wished. No longer bound to the bomber streams, they swept across the continent like tides of silver, hunting not just in the air, but on the ground. Airfields, convoys, trains, anything that moved became a target. Dawn after dawn, their engines broke the stillness of occupied Europe. Pilots called these missions rhubarbs, low-level strikes through fog and smoke, where every barn and every hedgerow might conceal a gun. The war in the air had come down to earth. For the Luftwaffe, there was no refuge. In the early months of 1944, its losses had been heavy. By midsummer, they were catastrophic. Fuel was vanishing, training schools were emptying, and the men who filled the cockpits were no longer veterans. They were boys, some with barely 20 hours of flight time. They took off trembling, unsure of their instruments, uncertain of their orders, and often never returned. In contrast, the Mustang squadrons were growing sharper, faster, colder. Each pilot was the product of survival, long missions over enemy territory, where endurance was as vital as aim. They had become not just soldiers, but professionals of the sky. The results spoke for themselves. In just 6 months, the P-51s claimed more than 5,000 enemy aircraft destroyed. Entire Luftwaffe groups were erased from the order of battle before they ever reached combat readiness. Fuel shortages sealed the rest. By July, German jet prototypes sat idle on runways, their tanks dry, their brilliance useless. Training flights were cancelled, patrols reduced to a handful of sorties. The Luftwaffe, which had once been defined by motion, was now trapped by stillness. Aces like Erich Hartmann and Walter Nowotny flew on borrowed time, their victories irrelevant against the sheer weight of attrition. From the air, the devastation was visible. Allied reconnaissance showed airfields littered with burnt fuselages, wrecks lined up wingtip to wingtip, black scars across the concrete. The Jagdwaffe, the fighter arm, had once symbolized the precision of the Reich. Now it was a museum of wreckage, its arrogance reduced to ash. Even the rhythm of battle had changed. Where once the Luftwaffe chose when and where to fight, now it reacted, always a step behind, always short of fuel, always hunted. German pilots took off knowing that Mustangs would already be waiting at altitude, invisible until the moment of attack. The old radio banter that once carried laughter and bravado was gone. What filled the airwaves now were clipped warnings, static, and silence. To those who had lived through the glory days of 1940, the transformation was almost unthinkable. The same Air Force that had once swept across Europe with unstoppable momentum was now grounded by scarcity. Its aircraft were still deadly, its pilots still brave, but courage without fuel and skill without numbers could not sustain an empire. The Mustang's presence was constant, merciless, and strangely impersonal. It did not fight for spectacle, only for purpose. Its long range turned every airfield into a target, every highway into a runway of destruction. From the Netherlands to Bavaria, the horizon belonged to its shadow. By August, even the most loyal German officers understood the truth. The Luftwaffe was no longer a weapon. It was a memory. Its strength had evaporated into the sky it once ruled. The Reich could still build planes, but it could not build pilots fast enough to fly them, nor refine fuel fast enough to feed them. Arrogance had burned itself out, and as the Allied armies pressed toward the Rhine, the sound of engines overhead told the real story. It was no longer the deep snarl of Messerschmitts or Focke-Wulfs. It was the steady, measured hum of Mustangs, an anthem of inevitability. The Luftwaffe had fallen from the sky long before Germany fell to the ground, and soon the rivers that once marked its borders would echo with those same engines, leading the way to the end. History remembers machines. It measures their speed, their range, their firepower. But every machine carries the shape of the men who fly it, the pulse of fear and will that no blueprint can capture. In 1944, as the Mustangs swept across Europe, their pilots became something more than airmen. They became the bridge between human endurance and mechanical perfection, fragile bodies guiding flawless steel. They were young, almost impossibly so. Most were in their early 20s, many barely older than the aircraft they flew. Don Gentile, George Preddy, Chuck Yeager, John Meyer, names that would echo through generations of aviation. They lived on black coffee, cold rations, and a kind of fatalism that bordered on calm. Each morning began with the same quiet ritual: a briefing, a cigarette, a glance at the map. Beyond that, everything was chance. To fly a Mustang was to balance on the edge of science and instinct. The cockpit was cramped, the canopy thin as a promise. At 30,000 feet, frost crawled across the glass, engines howled, and the world outside dissolved into cloud and contrail. Pilots fought not just the enemy, but the sky itself, thin air that clawed at their lungs, temperatures that froze the oil in their veins. They learned to read the language of the machine, the tremor of the stick, the pitch of the Merlin's roar, the subtle vibration that meant the engine was near its limit. Every mission was a coin toss with death. They joked about it, because they had to. Some painted dice on their aircraft, others carried lucky tokens, a letter, a medal, a photograph tucked behind the compass. They flew knowing that each sortie could be their last, that a moment's hesitation or a single hit could erase them from the formation without a trace. Yet in that uncertainty, a strange kind of peace formed. Brotherhoods emerged at altitude, silent and absolute. Each man learned to trust the others more than himself. They flew in pairs and squadrons, weaving through the chaos with precision that bordered on art. The radio was sparse, no chatter, only the clipped tones of habit. Check 6. Brake left. I've got him. Discipline became the true weapon. The Mustang was powerful, but it demanded restraint. It punished carelessness, rewarded patience. The pilots who mastered it did so not through recklessness, but through understanding of airspeed, of geometry, of rhythm. They fought in 3 dimensions, thinking in spirals and shadows. To survive was not luck, It was attention paid to every detail, every sound, every flicker of light. Losses were still heavy. Even the best were not spared. George Preddy, the highest-scoring Mustang ace, would fall before the war's end, shot down not by an enemy, but by mistake, a reminder that even gods of the sky bled like men. Don Gentile, whose kills made headlines back home, crashed his own plane on a victory roll, undone by celebration. Their stories carried the quiet truth of airmen everywhere. Mastery and mortality were never far apart, but something was changing. Where once dread had lived in every pre-flight silence, confidence now took its place. The pilots believed, not in invincibility, but in balance. They trusted their aircraft, trusted their training, trusted the invisible mathematics that kept them alive at 500 miles per hour. Technology and courage had finally met in the same cockpit. The Mustang's frame gave them reach, but their discipline gave it purpose. Together, they had turned survival into strategy, fear into focus. As they returned from missions, frostbitten, exhausted, eyes red from oxygen masks, they would taxi to the line, shut down the engines, and listen to the ticking metal as it cooled. The machine had done its part. So had they. Above them, contrails faded into the afternoon sky, quiet reminders of the men who did not return and of those who still would, because the war was not yet over. And the next horizon was already waiting. By autumn 1944, the skies above the Reich were no longer German. The air that had once carried the pride of the Luftwaffe, the defiant contrails of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, now belonged to the enemy. The horizon was a quiet procession of silver wings, the sound of liberty turned mechanical. For the first time since the war began, the Luftwaffe did not rule the morning. It hid from it. The decline had been steady, but by now it was absolute. Allied bombers roamed at will, striking refineries, railways, and synthetic fuel plants that were the lifeblood of the German war machine. Without fuel, even the most advanced aircraft became ornaments of defeat. Crews scavenged for gasoline in drums, siphoned from trucks, rationed by the liter. Sorties that once numbered hundreds now flew in handfuls. The airfields of the Reich were full, but not of power. They were full of silence. From above, the change was visible. Camouflage nets draped across runways, dummy planes built from wood, hangars buried in forest shadows. Where the Luftwaffe had once launched waves of interceptors, now its aircraft waited like hunted animals. The hunters, meanwhile, never stopped coming. The Mustangs circled day after day, their drop tanks gleaming in the sunlight, their pilots scanning for movement. At any sign of flight, they dived. The sky had become a trap. Even the arrival of the jet age could not reverse the tide. The Messerschmitt Me 262, sleek, fast, revolutionary, appeared at last, too late and in too few numbers. It was a glimpse of a future that Germany would never reach. There was no fuel to train its pilots, no safe airfields to base them from, no time to recover from years of attrition. The Luftwaffe's final hope was starved before it ever took shape. Inside Germany, the reality was inescapable. Young recruits, once the heirs to the legend of Galland and Hartmann, climbed into cockpits with 20 hours of flight time. They faced veterans who had flown 100 missions across 2 continents. The result was inevitable. The Luftwaffe had become a machine that consumed its own children. For the Allied airmen, it was victory measured in silence. Missions that once ended in fire and chaos now returned without opposition. The radio chatter grew lighter, the gun barrels cooled, the men still checked their instruments, still scanned the clouds, but fewer enemies appeared. Above the burning fields of Saxony and the shattered ruins of the Ruhr, they flew alone. What had begun as laughter, the arrogance of superiority, had ended in stillness. The Luftwaffe's roar, which had once shaken Europe, was gone. Its radar screens glowed faintly in abandoned bunkers, their signals unreturned. Its great names had either fallen in battle or watched their legacies turn to ash. The masters of the sky were now ghosts of their own invention. Even Allied commanders felt the unease of such total dominance. Eisenhower would later write that victory in the air had made the ground war possible, but also strangely hollow. There was no glory in an enemy too broken to fight back, only inevitability. And yet, for the men in the cockpits, the meaning was clear. Every mission, every flight, every sortie was proof of how far the war had turned, from survival to supremacy. They were no longer defending the bombers. They were carrying history itself. The air over Europe had been conquered, not by numbers, not by power, but by endurance. And as winter approached, that same air would carry the final invasion, across the Rhine, into Germany, and to the war's end. What had once been a sky of empires was now a sky of silence, and beneath that silence, the Reich waited for the sound of engines it could no longer resist. By March 1945, the war in Europe had become a matter of distance, and the last distance left was the Rhine. The river that had guarded Germany for centuries now marked the threshold of its defeat. On its western banks, Allied armies gathered in silence, their tanks and pontoon bridges ready. Above them, the air already belonged to someone else. The P-51 Mustangs rose before dawn, silver against the pale mist, engines murmuring in unison. They no longer hunted, they patrolled. Their mission was simple and final: clear the skies, hold the daylight, and protect the river crossing that would end the war in the west. At altitudes where breath turned to ice, they flew watchful patterns over a landscape collapsing beneath them. Below, German troops stared upward, helpless. They had once fought beneath the cover of the Luftwaffe, trusting the thunder of their own aircraft to guard the skies. Now, even daylight itself had turned foreign. Every open road was a target, every bridge a hazard, every movement a risk. The air, once their ally, was now their executioner. The Mustang swept in low over the water, strafing columns, intercepting the last remnants of German armor that tried to regroup. There was no longer resistance in the air, only fragments of defiance. The last Messerschmitts took off with half-trained boys in their cockpits, facing odds too great to measure. They climbed into the blue, saw the contrails above, and vanished into them. From the Allied side, it was a vision of completeness, the culmination of everything the air war had promised but never quite achieved until now. For the bomber crews, there was no longer fear, only rhythm. Climb, form up, cross, drop, return. Escorting Mustangs glided alongside them, the guardians of a sky that had ceased to be contested. The idea that once seemed impossible, that the Allies could fly unopposed over Germany, was now the norm. On the ground, the wreckage told its own story. Airfields lay abandoned. Hangars caved in, the skeletons of fighters lined up wingtip to wingtip like relics of a vanished faith. Mechanics who had once polished propellers now dug trenches. The great fighter arm of the Luftwaffe, the Jagdwaffe, had become myth, its mastery dissolved into memory. And still, the Mustangs flew on. Every day they crossed the river, their shadows sweeping over pontoon bridges and armored columns, ensuring that no German counterattack could ever rise from the sky. Their engines had become the pulse of inevitability. What began as an experiment of design now defined the geometry of victory. When the Allied forces finally crossed the Rhine, the war's last barrier was gone. The road to Berlin lay open. The Mustangs escorted the bombers one final time, not for survival now, but for closure. Their silver wings shimmered in the cold light, carrying the sound of history's final approach. Behind them, the empire that had laughed at American engineering was silent. Its airfields were graves, its skies monuments to the men and machines that had once believed themselves immortal. Above the river, the last echoes of the air war faded into distance, and in their place, the silence of victory began to fall, the stillness that comes not from peace, but from completion. The Rhine had been crossed, the sky had been conquered. The next and final journey would be east, toward Berlin, and the war's inevitable end. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the P-51 Mustang did not fade with the war it helped to win. It lingered, in hangars, in stories, and in the quiet admiration of those who understood what it had done. In the post-war years, engineers, historians, and pilots alike spoke of it not as a weapon, but as a milestone, the perfect summation of the piston age. Analysts called it the most important piston fighter ever built, not because it was the fastest or the strongest, but because it arrived precisely when history needed it most, a machine of balance, built for endurance in a world exhausted by extremes. The Mustang's marriage of speed, range, and reliability became the new standard by which all fighters would be measured. Its influence reached far beyond its era. The same principles that had guided its creation, efficiency over excess, adaptability over arrogance, would shape the jet age that followed. Aircraft designers studying the Mustang's laminar flow wings and long-range capability used its lessons to craft the next generation of fighters and bombers. Its legacy was not nostalgia, it was blueprint. And yet, the P-51 was more than machinery. It was a philosophy in aluminum, proof that genius could come from collaboration. It had been born of an Anglo-American partnership, a British engine in an American frame, built through cooperation, not competition. In a war defined by national rivalries, the Mustang represented something deeper, a union of ideas that transcended borders. Even as the world moved on to jets, the Mustang refused to become obsolete. It fought again, over Korea's mountains, in Israel's early wars, across the jungles and deserts of the post-colonial world. For 2 more decades, its engine's growl echoed wherever nations still fought with propellers. To young pilots, it was a rite of passage, demanding, graceful, and alive. To the veterans of Europe, it was an old friend that had never let them fall. By the 1950s, it had become something more than a weapon. Civilians bought them, air racers modified them, and museums enshrined them. Even the enemies who once cursed its silhouette found themselves paying tribute. Former German pilots, men who had once ruled the air, admitted with quiet sincerity, "We respected it, we feared it." The laughter of 1943 had turned to reverence. The Mustang's beauty was never vanity. It was efficiency made visible, every curve, every line serving purpose. Its presence on the ground still seemed restless, as if waiting for takeoff. To look at one, even today, is to see motion trapped in stillness. In many ways, the Mustang symbolized its generation, industrial democracy at its height, a machine born not of privilege or perfection, but of collective effort. Thousands of anonymous hands had riveted, tested, and flown it. It belonged to no single hero. It belonged to everyone who believed that precision could be mass-produced, that excellence could be built by many, and so history traded mockery for memory. The aircraft that once drew laughter from German aces became a legend of balance and endurance. It did not conquer through dominance, but through persistence, the quiet power of correction, the elegance of improvement. Long after its propellers stopped turning, the idea of the Mustang kept flying, in every machine that sought to do more with less, to go farther than it should, to survive because it must. The skies it once ruled are now calm. But somewhere, in the hum of every engine that takes flight, there remains a trace of that old melody, the sound of a machine that once redefined the air. And beyond the horizon, the legend of the Mustang still waits, not as a relic, but as a reminder of what imagination, when disciplined, can achieve. Victory in the air came at a cost that could not be measured in numbers alone. Behind every silver fuselage that returned to base, another lay burning in a field far from home. For all its brilliance, the Mustang could not make war cleaner, only possible. By the end of 1945, over 4,000 P-51s had been lost. Thousands of airmen were dead or missing, their names written into logbooks that would never be closed. The aircraft that carried them across continents could not carry them back, and in the empty bunks of English airfields, in Bottisham, Leiston, Debden, the silence spoke louder than any victory parade. Each bed, each unclaimed flight jacket, told the same story. Those who survived carried two weights, pride and guilt. They had conquered the skies, but not without losing something within themselves. Pilots who had laughed over coffee in the morning were gone by noon. Their wingmen returned with engines scarred and faces hollow. They learned to celebrate survival quietly, to honor victory without joy. Every mission that ended safely felt borrowed, as if luck had merely postponed a debt. The air war, once imagined as a clean frontier of technology, revealed itself to be a crucible of endurance. Men fought not just enemies, but elements, the freezing altitudes, the thin oxygen, the fatigue that blurred judgment after 10 hours of flight. They fought physics as fiercely as they fought the Luftwaffe. A malfunction, a misjudged climb, a moment's inattention could end a life as surely as any bullet. From a distance, history remembers the Mustangs, the sleek silhouettes, the triumph of design. But within the cockpit, the reality was simpler. Vibration, noise, fear. Pilots wrote letters in the dark, knowing they might never be read. They spoke of skies that shimmered with tracer fire, of the way sunlight turned blood into glass, of the strange peace that followed every dogfight. With time, the glory of the air war dimmed. What replaced it was not regret, but awe, a recognition of how much was risked for how much was gained. Machines had won the battle for the sky, but men had paid for it. Their courage was measured not in victories, but in persistence, the decision, repeated day after day, to climb back into a cockpit that had already taken friends away. In the years that followed, the survivors returned home to quiet lives. Some became instructors, others engineers. A few simply disappeared into ordinary towns. Yet none could escape the sound of that engine, the deep, rhythmic hum of the Merlin, echoing in memory. For them, it was not just a sound of power, but of presence, the proof that they had once flown higher than fear itself. The Mustang's shadow stretched into peace. It appeared at air shows, in museums, in photographs faded by sunlight. To the world, it symbolized victory. To those who had lived beneath its wings, it symbolized something gentler, endurance, loss, and the price of mastery. The sky had been conquered, but never truly tamed. Every contrail that faded into the blue still carried the memory of those who did not return. And as the decades passed, one truth remained clear. Machines may define an era, but it is men who give it meaning. When the war ended, the smoke cleared not just over cities, but over ideas. Every machine had carried a philosophy, every battle an argument about how to wage war. In the air, that argument had been decided, not by the fastest aircraft or the boldest design, but by the system that learned the quickest. The P-51 Mustang was not a miracle of invention, it was a miracle of adaptation. Others had built faster planes, stronger engines, more elegant designs. But the Allies, through patience, collaboration, and a willingness to change, built something greater than speed. They built understanding. Technology only mattered when joined with doctrine. The Mustang's success was not in its shape, but in its use. Its long range meant nothing until generals allowed pilots to roam free, to hunt instead of guard. Its power meant little until engineers learned how to keep it flying through the bitter European winters. It was never one decision that turned the tide. It was thousands of small corrections stacked upon each other that transformed defeat into dominance. Germany's error was not a lack of brilliance, it was too much of it. The Luftwaffe had prized genius, the revolutionary weapon, the perfect aircraft, the individual ace. Their factories built marvels, but their strategy remained rigid. They innovated without listening, creating answers to questions that the war had already changed. By the time their jets and rockets appeared, the skies they were meant to save had already been lost. America's strength, by contrast, was its faith in correction. Every failure became a workshop, every loss a lesson written in exhaust and blood. When bombers fell over Schweinfurt, new escort tactics were born. When engines froze over the Channel, mechanics rewrote their maintenance routines overnight. The system evolved faster than the enemy could recover. At 30,000 feet, the skies taught humility. Pilots who began the war in pride ended it in reflection. They had seen machines fail, heroes vanish, and technology tested to its limit. They learned that endurance, not brilliance, was the ultimate weapon. That victory belonged not to those who were perfect, but to those who refused to stop improving. Every contrail that crossed the sky carried that lesson. It was a white scar of persistence, a line drawn by men who understood that progress was not glory. It was repetition, discipline, and the courage to face error without denial. The P-51 embodied that quiet wisdom. It began as a rejected design, an unwanted prototype built in haste. It became, through refinement, the machine that defined the air war's outcome. Its story was the story of the Allied cause itself. Flawed at first, corrected through effort, perfected through cooperation. In the end, the Mustang did not just win battles. It redefined how to win them. It proved that innovation is not a spark, but a process. That strength lies not in the absence of failure, but in the refusal to repeat it. From that understanding came the air age that followed. Jets, missiles, supersonic flight, all born from the lessons written in the Mustang's wake. But every advance still carried a trace of that earlier wisdom, because progress, in war and in peace alike, is never loud. It does not shout its arrival or demand its place in history. It whispers through the corrections of those who dared to learn, and at 30,000 feet, above the ruins and rivers of Europe, the air still remembers. In 1943, high above occupied Europe, German fighter pilots laughed over their radios. The Americans, they said, were brave but naive, sending bombers deep into the continent with no escort that could follow them home. Their fighters, the P-47s and P-38s, could fight well enough near the coast, but over Germany they simply ran out of sky. The Luftwaffe's aces knew the pattern. Wait until the escorts turned back, then fall upon the unguarded bombers. To them, the air war was a ritual of inevitability, and when rumors began to spread of a new American fighter, one that claimed to fly to Berlin and back, the laughter only grew louder. They called it impossible. A fairy tale, a machine for propaganda, not for battle. Germany had the Messerschmitt, the Focke-Wulf, and soon the jet. The idea that a foreign aircraft could cross half a continent, fight, and return again was absurd. But in war, certainty is the first casualty. By 1944, those same voices that once mocked now spoke through static and panic. The impossible had arrived, long-nosed, gleaming, and relentless. The P-51 Mustang. At first sight, it looked too elegant to be lethal, but then it began to climb, to turn inside the Messerschmitts, to chase them over their own cities. The laughter ended in the scream of engines and the silence of loss. In March, the Mustangs escorted the bombers all the way to Berlin. German controllers shouted over their radios in disbelief as enemy fighters appeared above the capital of the Reich. Civilians looked up and saw silver wings circling through smoke. The city that had once been unreachable was now under escort. Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's chief of fighters, later wrote, "When we saw Mustangs over Berlin, we knew we had lost the air war. The Mustang did more than win battles, it redefined possibility. Its victory was not born from arrogance, but from adjustment, the patient refinement of design, the quiet correction of error. The P-51 was not a miracle born in a flash of genius. It was built from listening. Its creation embodied the moral of the war itself, that endurance outlasts brilliance and humility outperforms pride. Germany had invested in perfection, in superweapons and elite pilots. America invested in learning, in fixing what failed, in multiplying what worked. Each flight of the Mustang was an argument against hubris. Every mission that reached deeper into enemy territory was a lesson written in contrails, that adaptability is the true armor of progress. The air war had become a parable in motion. Those who adapt survive. Those who cling to certainty vanish with it. By 1945, the German skies were no longer theirs. The Luftwaffe, once Europe's most formidable air force, had dissolved into fragments. Its fuel gone, its aces spent, its arrogance spent with them. Below, cities lay in ruin. Above, the Mustangs circled in quiet dominion, ensuring that no enemy aircraft would rise again. For the men who flew them, there was no triumph in the silence, only understanding. They knew what the Mustang represented. It was not just a fighter, it was the shape of consequence, the proof that every idea dismissed as impossible has its hour, and that pride is always the first to fall. When the war ended, the Mustang returned to stillness. Its engine cooled, its wings folded under hangar light, but even at rest, it carried its meaning. That mastery is not born from brilliance, but from belief. That progress is a conversation between failure and persistence. In the end, the war in the air was not simply about machines or even men. It was about the ideas that built them, ideas that lived or died according to their capacity to adapt. And in that sky, where arrogance once laughed and courage once climbed, one truth endures. The P-51 did not just escort bombers to Berlin. It escorted the modern world into the age of endurance. They laughed once, they never laughed again.